and she's involved in the Youth Against Racism in Europe in the 90s, which so the BNP kicked out of the Brick Lane when they were trying to kind of do the similar things like the EDL now. But also that particular campaign shut down the BNP headquarters as well. And Hannah played an important role at the time, wealth of experience she has, and she's been writing about it a lot. And also she's an author of a book, Socialism in 21st Century. And unfortunately we don't have that book now, but we can take orders. We can take orders. And she's extensively, she's written quite a number of numerous articles on the subjects as well, and so on. And also locally, the EDL been properly defeated for they've been marching in various boroughs and so on. But here in Walthamstow, they had a major defeat, and Hannah also played a part again in that as well. So thanks for coming to speak to us.
Okay, thank you very much, Sinan. That was a overly complimentary introduction. It makes it sound like I did all those things on my own, whereas in fact it was as part of a big movement. I think I won't stand up because it's not that big a meeting, although this is a very short chair with a tall table, so I feel a bit short sitting here, but anyway, never mind. So as Sinan said, then this meeting is taking place today in the context of the campaign against the EDL, far-right racist thugs here in Walthamstow, and you've obviously taken the decision to change your subject because of that campaign. And we've had victories, 2 victories now really, because on the 1st of September they were meant to march and there was a massive demonstration of the local population that made it impossible for the EDL to march, and yesterday they didn't even dare step foot in Walthamstow because fundamentally of the level of local opposition. So I will make some points on that specific campaign later on. But the title you've given the meeting is How Do We Fight Racism? So I thought before I came to the specifics of the campaign in Walthamstow, I should say a little bit about socialists and the Socialist Party's approach to the issue in general. There's a famous black American revolutionary called Malcolm X who said that you can't have capitalism without racism. And while it's true that before the development of capitalist society, of course, there was prejudice against people from different societies and groupings and so on, nonetheless, racism in its modern form is a product of capitalism and the development of capitalism. And if you go back to what Karl Marx talked about, the primitive accumulation of capitalism, when, if you like, capitalism developed the resources to go on to dominate the globe, and countries like Britain in particular led the way on that, then it was the slave trade and the subjugation, particularly of the peoples of Africa, that gave the lion's share, if you like, of the booty in order to go on to develop capitalism. And racism was developed as an ideology in order to justify slavery. But even after slavery became redundant for capitalism, and therefore all of a sudden Britain led the world's campaign against the slave trade, which was entirely because it suited their interests for British capitalism at that time. Nonetheless, they adapted racist ideology and created this kind of pseudo-scientific rubbish, but it was in order to justify the colonial oppression of the peoples of Africa, Asia, Latin America, the majority of the world. Now today, as obviously everybody here knows, the colonial revolutions, the fight against colonial rule, means that that no longer exists. But nonetheless, the imperialist multinational companies still dominate the globe, not least British multinational companies, and the world structures that back that up, the IMF, the World Bank and all the rest of them, play the role of backing multinational companies, subjugating economically the peoples of the majority of the world. And racism, in a more subtle form, continues to be used to justify that. I mean, this is a kind of minor example, but it really struck me. I was on a question time debating panel with different Tory and other politicians in a university in Exeter a few weeks ago, and we got onto the Arab Spring. Someone asked a question about the Arab Spring, And both of the Tories responded by saying, of course it's good that these people, these ignorant, he didn't actually use the word ignorant, but it's what he meant, these ignorant people have finally found out about democracy and we must assist them in understanding democracy. And it was just riven with the kind of, when of course, you know, as I pointed out, the dictators that have dominated the Middle East have done so with the full backing and connivance of US and British imperialism in order for them to be able to get oil and everything else that they want from the region. But it was the kind of racist idea that somehow the Arab people were too stupid to have democracy, and that's why there hadn't been movements for democracy before then. So it might be subtler, but all of the same ideas still exist today. But then also, racism is a tool used by the capitalists within the economically advanced countries like Britain, like the US, in order to divide working people. Any society where you've got a tiny minority, the 1% or whatever it is in Britain, who have enormous wealth and power, while the majority do not and are getting poorer by the day, it's inevitable that that 1% have to use different prejudice to try and divide the 99%, and they use all kinds of things. You can see at the moment they're trying to divide public and private sector workers from each other, saying they don't have the same interests in common. They try and divide the young and the old from each other, but they also use racism as a means to try and divide the working class. If you look at Greece at the moment, and I'm going to refer to Greece a few times, only because in Greece there is a severe economic depression, much more severe than we've got in Britain at the moment. The working class is struggling heroically. They've had 20 general strikes in Greece against the driving down of their living conditions. And so, if you like, Greece is our future if we don't fight, and many of the things that are worse in Greece could develop here as well in the future, and therefore it's quite an interesting parallel to draw with Britain. And there was an article in The Guardian yesterday about Greece, which was describing how the Golden Dawn, who are far-right, neo-fascist thugs, who go around murdering immigrants openly, whose public policy is for the mining of the borders, so that anybody who tries to cross the borders into Greece is killed. You know, they're horrific, and they also go around attacking the left and so on. But the article in The Guardian yesterday was describing how, over a whole period of time, they have been allowed to infiltrate the police. And that it's really a conscious strategy, at least by a section of the capitalists, to encourage these far-right fascist thugs to play a role in the state machine. And that is a reflection that the Greek capitalist class, their system is in an absolute crisis. Everybody's living conditions are being driven down. The capitalists have no way out of the situation. And they have a working class that is rising up against them. And they are prepared to use desperate measures in order to try and prevent the working class pushing capitalism aside. And so a section of them are prepared to rely on thugs like the Golden Dawn. A majority are also frightened of the Golden Dawn and the instability that they mean. I mean, even a majority of the capitalists, and don't want them to come to power or anything like that, but they're quite prepared to use them as thugs in order to weaken the workers' movement. And even that majority, who don't want Golden Dawn to grow, who are frightened by them amongst the capitalist class and the ruling elite, nonetheless, in order to maintain power, still whip up the prejudices that allow Golden Dawn to grow. So every ruling party in Greece has carried out vicious cuts in living standards, and every ruling party has encouraged the idea that it's immigrant workers to blame. Because in order to keep onto their own power, then that's, you know, they have to blame somebody, and that's an easy road to kind of whip up racism in that way. And that, of course, even if that's not the intended consequence, then makes it easier for the Golden Dawn to grow. And it's the same here in Britain. All of the capitalist politicians will condemn the likes of the English Defence League, the British National Party, and so on. But nonetheless, the anti-migrant worker propaganda of this Tory government creates the ground for groups like the EDL to grow. And even before that, under the new Labour government, they whipped up anti-migrant worker propaganda. It was more complicated, as I'll refer to later, but they also went to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the EDL claim that they're not racist, they're only against Muslims. And they do that because prejudice against Muslims was whipped up on such a big scale by New Labour, by going to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, that, if you like, is the cutting edge of racism in Britain today. Of course, it would be foolish to imagine that groups like the EDL therefore only attack Muslims. They attack anybody with a different colour skin who looks to them like they might conceivably be Muslim. But nonetheless, that's the kind of cutting edge of the propaganda, and that comes from what took place under the new Labour government. Now, at the same time, and I'd be interested to know what people in the room think about this, but we would say that in society in general in Britain, blatant racism is less acceptable today than it would have been 25 or 30 years ago when I was young and growing up. So what I mean by that is the kind of racist chanting on the football terraces that was just normal would not be acceptable to the same degree today. Ordinary people, most young people today would say that they are anti-racist, ordinary young people. I don't mean there's no racism at all. Yeah, I don't in any way mean there's no racism, that's what that sentence was that meant to mean. But public attitudes have shifted compared to the crude and blatant racism that existed 25 or 30 years ago. Now, why has that changed? In our view, the most important reason is the increased confidence of the black and Asian communities that suffered that racism. That has been the biggest thing that has changed the situation. Sinan mentioned in his introduction that I was involved in the campaign against the British National Party in the early 1990s, and there were two really sites for that. One was down in Welling, where their headquarters were, which I'll talk about later, but the other was in Tower Hamlets, which was a Bangladeshi population overwhelmingly, and at that stage were quite new to the country and therefore less confident generally than would have been the case with the African Caribbean or the Pakistani or other longer standing migrant communities. And the BNP went to Tower Hamlets every Sunday with 30 or 40 thugs, supposedly for a paper sale. But there was no one to sell to. The population were Bangladeshi. They were there to frighten people. That's what they were there to do. And they also went around smashing the windows of the restaurants and so on. They then got a councillor elected in the white part of Tower Hamlets on the Isle of Dogs, or the predominantly white part of Tower Hamlets on the Isle of Dogs. And we were involved in the campaign that drove the BNP out of Tower Hamlets at that time. And it's true that occupying the BNP's paper sale and preventing them from ever coming back, that was done by trade unionists and young people involved in the socialist movement at that time, not in the main by the local Bangladeshi population. But we went down there for 6 weeks on a Sunday morning when they did this sale, before we actually occupied the site. And every Sunday morning we were discussing with the young generation of Bangladeshi activists. The older generation's general approach was keep your heads down, it's better not to cause trouble. But the younger generation wanted to change things. They didn't want to accept those people being there. And it was only when they were convinced of that and were prepared to defend their communities, because if you drive those thugs off, they can come back and attack people. You've got to be ready to defend yourself. That we then went ahead and occupied the site. And in the wake of that, there was big community self-organisation. None of us had mobile phones back then, so we had things called the whistle alarms that were organised on all of the estates, where if anybody saw a member of the BNP, they blew whistles. They came out on the balconies, because there were those kind of blocks of flats, and got everybody else out, and the young people in the community chased the BNP away, and that's what forced the BNP out of the area. And in general, the shift in social attitudes is a reflection of the increased self-confidence and determination of young, in particular, black and Asian people from different communities to fight back. At the same time, the other side of it was the role that was played by the trade union movement and the workers' movement. And again, it's not our job to kind of prettify things and make out that everything's perfect. There was and still is widespread racism amongst people or members of trade unions and in the trade union movement. But nonetheless, the trade union movement in Britain played a major role in fighting against racism, because they understood it was in the end their self-interest to do so. So if you go back to the 1950s, when the first wave of workers, mainly from South Asia and African Caribbean workers, who came to Britain to do cheap labour jobs, that's why big business brought them over. And for example, in London, then the Railway Workers Union was faced with a situation where African Caribbean workers were doing the night shifts on the railways, were doing all of the harder jobs and were not getting the rate for the job. And so they'd been brought in to undermine the conditions of the NUR. And the initial reaction was racism. But the best of the union activists recognised that wasn't going to work. And so instead, they went and recruited those workers to the NUR, was the name of the Railway Workers Union at the time, and organised a joint campaign that those workers should get the same pay and conditions as the rate for the job, and they won that. And then, at that time, there were still colour bars on all the pubs in central London. It was the Railway Workers Union who systematically went round and broke those colour bars and said, we're not accepting them, anybody can come into this pub, and so on. I know drinking in pubs may not seem the most important issue, but nonetheless, we don't support people's right to go wherever they want, including into pubs. So those positive traditions of the trade union movement, which came from an understanding that the only way you defend workers' pay and conditions is to defend all workers' pay and conditions, whatever country they originate from, that has had consequences, which means even now, if you look at the figures, the membership of trade unions amongst African, Caribbean and South Asian workers is much higher than it is amongst the white population, because there was a recognition these people are going to fight for us and fight in our interests. Now, all of those positive things mean that there is less blatant racism in Britain today, but it does not in any way mean that racism has gone away. So, you know, everyone here probably knows the figures, but if you're young and male and black or Asian, you are 44 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police than if you're a young white male. In my area, there's just been this case of a young black man who was arrested and called all kinds of racist abuse by the police, and the policeman's just got off on a second trial on the incredible argumentation, I mean, you can't believe it, that he was trying to increase the young man's confidence by swearing and shouting all kinds of racist abuse at him and beating him up and the rest of it. So, you know, no one is suggesting that racism has gone away. More than half of young black men are unemployed, 55%, compared to, on average, a quarter of young people being unemployed. And there were also new complications, because under the last new Labour government, I don't know how long I've been talking. How long have I been talking today? Okay, so I'm carrying on. So under the last, that's so not true, but anyway, yeah. Under the last Labour government, then they had a different policy to the question of immigration controls and people coming into the country than this Tory government has, or actually previous Labour governments had had. They talked in anti-migrant terms, so they used all the same propaganda. They were extremely discriminatory against asylum seekers, with detention centres, deporting people, all of those things took place. But at the same time, in a conscious attempt to lower wages, they actually made it easier, particularly for workers from Eastern Europe in the main, to come into Britain in much larger numbers than had been the case previously. And so it meant that we had the biggest in modern British history increase in the population as a result of people coming mainly from Eastern Europe, and it was a conscious policy by big business because they wanted to use that to lower wages. There was all the propaganda at the time, British workers are too lazy, you know, they're not prepared to be our cleaners, we need workers from other countries who are prepared to work for peanuts, etc., etc. Now when the Tories were elected, they did it partly by stepping up anti-migrant worker propaganda. Initially, under pressure from the CBI and big business, they didn't actually change the position. They continued the same sort of policy because they also want to lower wages. That's starting to change now. They're now turning their propaganda into an increase in really repressive measures against workers coming into the country to work, and it's possible they will even start to use those against Eastern Europeans at the moment, still have the legal right to come into the country, but they can step that up further in the run-up to the next election. Now, all of that complicates the situation. For our position as socialists, we have to fight for the real right to asylum, the right for families to be reunited, for the closure of detention centres, against deportations. We have to fight against all of these barbarous measures that are being pointed out, carried out, and we have to point out people are being deported who are only being forced to seek asylum because of wars fought by British imperialism. You know, all of those arguments we have to make. But at the same time, you look at the opinion polls in Britain at the moment, a majority of working class people think there should be no more immigration into Britain. And it would be a mistake for us to take a very crude approach that shows that the majority of the working class in Britain are racist and beyond hope and we can't reach them and so on. Because we have to recognise that part of that is a feeling that if more people come into the country, then that means that it'll be even harder for us to get a job, harder for us to get a house, and that affects the white working class in the main, but also older people who came second or third generation to Britain, the feeling we just can't cope with more people coming into the country. And so we have to take those arguments up very patiently and go back to the idea of the railway workers after the Second World War, who said that only by fighting for everybody to get the right for the job, by strengthening the workers' movement, can we prevent big business using workers from other countries to lower wages. And we've been able to do that quite effectively in Britain, where we've been in a position to succeed. So, for example, I don't know if you remember, but a couple of years ago in 2009, there were big strikes of oil refinery construction workers. And they were all over the national news because they had banners saying British jobs for British workers. And actually that was partly because Gordon Brown, whipping up racism at the same time as their immigration policy, had used the phrase British jobs for British workers, and those workers were copying it. Now there were other socialists, people from the Socialist Workers' Party for example, who just said these people are racist, they're beyond hope. We went to those workers and said, look, it was Italians actually who had undermined their pay and conditions. We said, it's not their fault, it's the fault of big business, it's the fault of your bosses. And the only way you're going to stop it is by fighting for everybody to get your terms and conditions. And we convinced them of that. So that was the demands of the strike. And in the end, that strike, I mean, first of all, they shouted Workers of the World Unite at their rallies on the gates and so on, but also they won for themselves, but also for the Italian workers who had initially been used to undermine their pay and conditions. So you can cut across that kind of feeling if you take that sort of class-based approach. Now that really links to the questions about how we take up the English Defence League, these racist hooligans in Walthamstow and elsewhere. And it is an important issue because it was a big victory, them not coming to Walthamstow, and they're in disarray at the moment. They're all fighting amongst themselves. The EDL may be finished as an organisation. The British National Party, the other kind of main far-right racists, are also in complete disarray and fighting amongst themselves at the moment. So you could think, well, why do we have to bother about this? But the thing is, the potential for organisations like that to grow still exists. There are still many disaffected young people who are angry about not having jobs and homes, and the potential for them to blame black and Asian workers for that is still there. So while maybe, who knows, the EDL may spring back, but even if they don't, there can be other organisations like them. So we've got to discuss how you take them up. And again, look at the Golden Dawn in Greece. They, a couple of years ago, were on 0.7% of the vote. Now they're on 12% of the vote in the opinion polls. They've grown dramatically. Now the left has grown more. The biggest left sort of socialist force in Greece is on about 22%, Syriza in the polls. So it's not that the Golden Dawn are about to come to power, but they're growing and they're a danger, and the question of how the left takes them up and counters them is really important. And while it is less intense here at this stage, it's not as big a danger, we would say basically the same method still applies. So if you look at the EDL, the first thing is you want a mass mobilisation against them. You need to show any young people who might be attracted to the far-right thugs of the English Defence League, the majority are against these people and you don't want to go joining them. So you need to mobilise as many as possible on the streets. And by the way, the other side of the campaign in the early 1990s, it drives me up the wall, it really makes me angry, all the stuff in the press about the terrible murder of Stephen Lawrence down in Welling, but how then there was a campaign by government and the law and lawyers, and suddenly everything was better and there wasn't racism anymore because it's absolute rubbish. Stephen was the fourth young person to be murdered in that area, all within a quarter of a mile of the headquarters of the British National Party. And the BNP were driven out of that area, not by the government, not by lawyers, but by a mass mobilisation. 50,000 of us marched against the BNP headquarters at that point in time, and that was what made any young people in that area who thought maybe the BNP were a good thing decide, no, they're definitely, we don't want anything to do with them, might is against us, and drove them out of the area. And then after that, the council came up with excuses about planning laws and other stuff, and the Macpherson report came out, but it was in response to a mass movement. The mass movement came first. So you want to mobilise as many people as possible, but you also want to make sure for us as socialists in the Socialist Party and for trade unionists that as big a part of that movement as possible is organised on a clear class programme. So we marched in Welling under the slogan of jobs and homes, not racism. And our young members went into all the youth clubs in that community and argued with young people who were attracted to the BNP at that stage. It's a mainly white area and was so even more then. And said, these people aren't standing up for you. We're the ones who are standing up for ordinary working class people, and you've got more in common with young black people from the neighbouring borough, from Bromley or wherever, than you have with big business, the bosses, the Tory government and so on, and you should... So in other words, we won them over with a class appeal. And we would say it's very important today that the anti-racist movement, again, even more important in a way, mobilises around class slogans, because the economic situation is much worse now. The cuts are much worse. And we think it was a mistake by the majority in the campaign against the EDL in this area to slavishly follow behind, particularly Labour politicians, but Labour politicians who are supporting cuts. Stella Creasy, the MP in this area, has said quite clearly that she thinks every bit of public expenditure should be looked at, that cuts in public services should be made. The local council have carried out major cuts, and they were kind of given an uncritical platform in the campaign against the EDL in Waltham Forest, except that we fought and said, no, it can't be uncritical. We're not saying you never have these people to speak, but if you have them to speak, then you attack the fact that they're carrying out cuts in living standards. And you make it clear that we're fighting for ordinary people, and we had to really campaign to make sure we have people putting that forward on the platform. But we did so at every stage. It is probably clearer to people if you use the example of Greece again. So in Greece, living standards have fallen by an average of 30%. The cuts have been absolutely huge. People are destitute. The hospitals cannot feed the people in the hospitals. It's, you know, it's a collapse to the situation, economic situation of a neo-colonial country from having been a relatively, they thought, you know, wealthy European country. The governments that have carried out those cuts are PASOK, the equivalent of the Labour Party, and New Democracy, the equivalent of the Tories. Golden Dawn have gone from 0.7% to 12% in that period. The idea that the way socialists should defeat Golden Dawn in Greece would be to organise demonstrations where you got the leaders of PASOK to speak on the platform and say, Golden Dawn are terrible and we're great, and you wouldn't criticise them. That would be the way to have Golden Dawn get mass support just like that. And that, unfortunately, is the approach of some in the anti-racist movement in Britain. Our attitude is, of course, anyone can march against the EDL, and we welcome everyone coming out. Tory voters, Labour, the works. But we, as socialists, have to fight for the workers' movement to be central to that struggle, and we have to make sure that from the platforms we are putting a clear class position. So, really, just to kind of summarise, then how do you fight racism in the far right? We want a mass mobilisation of the work of as many people as possible, but we want to make sure that the working class and class politics are at the core of that as the most effective means of cutting across racism. We want to make sure that any young people or others who are attracted to the far right can see clearly that the mass of people are against them as a result of the scale of the mobilisation, but also that it's the workers' movement that's fighting in their interests and not these thugs from the far right. In my view, one of the reasons that some on the left kind of just don't even think about cutting across the potential support for the far right is because they think if a working class person is racist, then they should be written off and they're absolutely, you know, beyond hope, they're the enemy. We oppose racism completely, we campaign against it, but we also recognise that the way people think changes according to circumstances. My very first involvement in politics was during the miners' strike in the mid-1980s, a year-long strike, heroically by miners. In my area, the mine was in a village outside the town. It was Cannock Chase, which is a little village, and then Wolverhampton, which was a multi-ethnic town, was the town nearby. Those miners, when they first walked out on strike, thought they were members of the National Front, the equivalent of the BNP at the time. They didn't know what it meant or anything, but it's because they were racist. That was within days, their attitude had been transformed, because they'd seen It was the workers' movement that was fighting for them. It was the Sikh and Hindu temples in Wolverhampton that were raising money for them and taking it out for them. They understood about workers' unity and their attitude was transformed. So, you know, if they'd remained supporting the NF, we would have fought against those ideas vigorously. But we also recognise that the experience of class struggle and fighting back can change things. In Britain at the moment, we have to fight against racism, but we also have to fight to take the struggle against cuts forward. And if we get a successful 24-hour general strike, which is against all cuts and makes it clear that it's against cuts in public services, it's against cuts in those things that particularly affect people from other countries, like councils no longer providing translations of leaflets and all of those kind of things, as well as against the closures of libraries, privatisation of schools, and we mobilise workers from every background together to come out on the streets, that will do more to cut across racism than any other amount of campaigning that we can do. And Malcolm X was right. As long as you have capitalism, we will have racism. But at the same time, in the struggle for a different society, in our view for a socialist society, you can unite workers, and if you like, you can have the embryo of a new and better society. You can win the most conscious elements of the working class to a clear anti-racist position, and therefore it cut across racism to some extent, at least in society as well. So,